talking, surprises, other things.
Sometimes I'm very curious about the other group.
Oh, you want them to out themselves?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, the first thing you have to invoke is confidentiality, so too bad.
I just find it.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. Yep. No other questions or anything pending we need to talk about? Yes.
Okay, there was a story in the Yancey book,
Uh-huh.
and it was like one of the, I don't know if it was a parable in the Bible, but I think it was a parable. But it was about how, like, it was like one that he said goes unnoticed, and it's about like the person who pays them, he like gave them all the same amount, even though
Right.
they didn't work the same amount.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, so one, that gave me a much different perspective of grace than I had thought. And then like it made me ask a lot more questions, and then it made me realize how much I don't understand it, because I was just like, yeah, why did he? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I really was with him, like, but you know, he didn't work, you know.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it had a lot more to do with like not understanding what the guy who pays him gets out of it, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, not to mention, I mean, the conversation that I think we end up having around justice and fairness. And you know, when we demand equality, fairness, justice, there's got to be a judge of it somewhere. And and so, I mean, when he's questioned by the people, I mean, there are two different responses, which is kind of fascinating, right? It's like, I get to do with my resources what I choose to do. And then the other side of it is these people that came in on the tail end of the day, I can bless them that way. I can grace them that way. So yeah, and I think that ends up being kind of a growing realization for a lot of people that, yeah, we identify shame pretty easily, I think. But the other side of that is we end up kind of getting slapped in the face, and maybe we don't understand grace as much as we thought we did. So yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Okay, well, I want to continue on some of this. Again, some of this is review because you've been reading in Brown's book, but then there's some others that we will get to that might be new material for a lot of you. So before we get into that, let me pray. Father, we give over at this time to you. Pray that you will guide our hearts into grace and into grace with ourselves as well. Even as we listen to the material and think not only about the people that we're hanging out with, but also just the person that we are. And as hard as it is to look at that without layering on a variety of narratives that say something to the effect of, well, I get what I deserve. And so allow us the opportunity to hang loosely onto that old narrative and push forward into the new one that calls us your beloved, and that you delight in us. So thank you for your love. Thanks for your passionate pursuit of us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I think kind of where we left off was here. The thing that I need to kind of re-highlight is that the embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, shame are different manifestations. They're not all shame, but I think generally what ends up happening is that we tend to label them as that. Okay, so they feel like shame when in fact they probably aren't, at least three of those. So the embarrassment is fleeting. We said it's temporary. Sometimes we look back at it and chuckle. It's not something that adds to that's the self-condemnation that we end up finding ourselves. The second one is the guilt, and making this differentiation. You've heard this over and over again. Guilt and shame are both based in self-evaluation. We kind of get in this place where we're busy not only interacting with the person that we're interacting with, but we're also kind of outside of ourselves, spectating on how we're handling ourselves and what we're saying, how we're saying it. Guilt is connected. I did something bad. Shame is I am bad, in various variations that are very much a part of the landscape. So the issue is performance versus person, as I pointed this out to you before. I did something bad is a performance issue. I am bad is a person issue. And that's really the distinction, because in a lot of cases what we find is that we're trolling for evidence of this identity, this bad identity. And so the guilt and shame are both based in self-evaluation. In a lot of cases, and certainly in a lot of sermons I've heard, pastors just conflate these two things together. And they say guilt and shame as if they're interchangeable, when in fact it's not the case at all. But I think in general parlance, general language, we don't make any distinction because they tend to feel the same. And so because they tend to feel the same, we often miss kind of the subtleties that go along with that. So guilt is comparing, the way to think this through is guilt is comparing our actions or behaviors against some kind of ethics, values, or beliefs. In the Christian context, a lot of times we refer to this as conviction. And so, and I've mentioned to you before the 2 Corinthians 7 chapter where Paul talks about his chastisement and his admonishment of the Corinthian church led to godly sorrow that led to life. And that would certainly be what we could attach to guilt, because it motivated them to change, to move toward life itself. Worldly sorrow, he continues, is that which leads to death, and that would fit in with shame. So guilt, there's nothing, fundamentally bad about guilt. If anything, if we're open to getting the feedback we need, guilt motivates us to make the changes necessary. We don't think that it's evidence for the condemnation of our person. And that's the thing that tends to crop up, I think, over and over again, because we're so accustomed to making the conclusion that I did something bad and therefore I'm condemned. And the thing to keep in mind is when we jump to that conclusion, then a person condemned cannot really get out of that place. So how do I make changes around that? I mean, it's one thing to say I'm guilty. I might be able to do something differently to become not guilty. But on the other hand, when I'm condemned, it's harder to get out of that state. And generally, that's exactly why shame is so tough, because it is an attachment to our identity, how we identify ourselves, how we see ourselves, and everything that goes with it. So guilt is about performance. It can be adjusted and changed relatively easily. And that's, again, what happens, think for a minute, what happens when a friend comes and says, you said something that really hurt my feelings? And where do we run to? Right out of the gate. And most of the time people will say, well, I'm feeling bad. But we don't differentiate that badness feeling. Is it help me understand what I've done so I can change it the next time? Or is it just more proof of how awful a person I am? And those kinds of words are pretty damning for one, but also just really very much connected to our identity for a second one. Shame's about our person. It cannot be adjusted or changed very easily. It is comparing our worth and value as a person against a mythical, which is key, mythical or ideal standard of personhood. And so when we talk about and look at and discuss perfection versus excellence, for example, that mythical ideal is always changing. As soon as I get anywhere close to it, it always gets more perfectionistic, not less. And so it is a comparison of our worth and value, who we are, compared to some mythical idea. So, I should know better has to have, to some degree, a rejoinder that says, know better of what, or compared to whom. And in a lot of cases, people will say, well, I don't know, but the comparison is to the ideal me, not to the real me, to the ideal me. And so I will never win that battle. I will never win that battle because the ideal me is always getting better than the real me is. And so I'm caught in this conundrum here. So the one thing I've noticed is that people that are struggling with shame are far more likely to engage in self-destructive behaviors in response to shame, not in response to guilt. Trying to make the conversion from shame to guilt, in other words, there's things I can do differently here, is a really hard conversion to make because shame works. I mean, honestly, shame works. We can change behavior on a dime in response to shame. But guilt takes longer. It takes time to get the feedback needed and practice and learning, failures in learning to be able to get it right, if you will, or not even get it right, get it better. And so it's important to keep in mind in that regard because we engage, I think people, when I say self-destructive behaviors, we usually think in terms of the extreme. And the extreme being, whether that's cutting behaviors or self-destructive thoughts or things like that, we think in the extreme. But there's lots of other things that we do that is self-destructive. Like, for example, withholding good from ourselves. That's self-destructive. And it also is indicative of the things that we believe about ourselves. So somebody offers us grace, okay, and now we can always be referring back to the clips of video I showed you from Les Mis. Somebody's always offering me grace, and I withhold it because I believe I'm not worthy of what I'm being given. And that's self-destructive. So if I embrace it and allow myself to engage it, change occurs as a result. But we can withhold or obstruct the good that's offered to us. I can tell you, and really I can't count how many times over the years, let me put this away, where I've been talking to a variety of people in counseling, whether it's women or men, and in a lot of cases, because they've made the conclusion that they're not worthy of anything good, they sabotage any good that's in their lives. Like good people. People that are there and saying, I accept you as you are. It's like, well, it can't be that good. And so then we sabotage the good, fight ensues or something ensues, the person leaves, and where do we end up? See, I told you. You didn't deserve it anyway. And so we do a variety of things that all fall into self-sabotaging or self-destructive behaviors. Or we also externalize it into silencing ourselves. I'm not that important. Somebody doesn't need to hear from me. Sometimes this one operates in groups. What I have to say is really not that important. So it doesn't compare to anything else anybody else has to say. So I'm not going to say anything because it doesn't really count. So we silence ourselves, and then then it goes a little farther than that, because when I silence myself, then it's starting to say, well, I'm not really worthy of people listening to, but I sure wish somebody would care enough about me to get me to talk. And when I do talk, then I'm back to the shame again. It is a vicious cycle for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I grew up Christian, so I feel like a lot of the time, even still like in the CC community,
Mm-hmm.
people always say like, oh, we're so unworthy, we're so undeserving of God's grace, And it's like, if we're constantly told that our whole lives, like, we're unworthy, we're undeserving of grace, how are we expected to just like make that change that, oh, I am worthy of grace, when our whole lives and like still to this day Christians have this thing that
Yep.
you're unworthy of everything that God's given you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well said. Yeah.
It's like Christians say all the time. It's like, how do you get out of that? It's like,
Yeah.
you're supposed to do your worthy, yet you're also unworthy. It's kind of like a catch, like,
Yeah, well, it is. It is. It's a double bind. As the old phrase goes, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. The question is if I embrace my worthiness, what are Christians so afraid of? by embracing their worthiness. Yeah, Isaac?
On top of that, what do you do with theology of the wretch, like the wretchedness of humanity?
Yeah.
How do we work with that? Think about that a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll address it here. I don't have any of the answers. I'll just address it somehow. I don't know. Yeah.
Something we learned in my historical theology class that I think contrasts that view is something that Irenaeus talks about. Is we're opposed to the body itself as the corrupt and evil thing. We're born into death's land, and the first breath we breathe brings sin into us, but it doesn't mean that our body is inherently bad or we're that this minute wretch that doesn't deserve grace or anything. We were created in His image, and we've been corrupted by sin by being born into death's land.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool, and I was like, oh, shame and grace.
But I mean, Irenaeus's revolt was against Aristotle's view of the body being fundamentally corrupt. And so there's nothing good can happen here. I think, yeah, what'd you call it? The theology of the wretch? Is that what you said, Isaac?
Like the theology of the wretch, or like the wretchedness of humanity.
Yeah.
We're inhuman, that's it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, word, that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Martin Luther had to speak at the Diet of Worms. I wonder what that means. Yeah, sounds awful. Anyway, the what's conveyed, particularly with stuff like that, is that, and I think it goes to a lot of the same kind of narrative we've got going in the Christian community, is usually those narratives are there to prevent something from happening rather than embrace something that exists. And so the question is what is it trying to prevent? And in a lot of cases, I think the attempt is to prevent thinking too highly of ourselves. But then the only way that we can do that is an error in the opposite direction, and that is thinking so lowly of myself that I don't count for anything, which goes to the wretchedness idea. That's, to me, like I said, that's our error in the opposite direction. I don't think it's, so there's a lot of times when people talk about humility, what's humility for? To guard against pride, right? And that's not humility. That's a strategy to control pride, but that's not humility. Humility arises out of some inner condition that I've cultivated that isn't about self-deprecation and self-loathing. It's about being fully who I am as God's beloved, and I've been made worthy. And so how do I live that way? Do I run the risk of thinking more of myself than I am? Yeah, of course. Paul talks about that. Even in Galatians, he talks about that. That verse I showed you from Boundaries. So, yes, I run that risk, but free children who have not learned shame run risks all the time. They make mistakes and they learn and they move on. But we've gotten this overlay of shame that says, don't ever make a mistake. Don't ever do it wrong. Don't be perfect all the time. And that's the way God will bless you. Which, even when I hear that, I want to throw up. Because there are so many, in the midst of all of the prophetic utterances in the Old Testament, there are time and time these little shining gems that come out about how wretched and awful Israel is, for example, or the northern kingdom or anything. And then something all of a sudden takes the prophet and he goes, speaking for God, I will come as your Redeemer and I will sing over you with joy. So if I'm so wretched, why would God say that? Yeah.
Oh, well, I kind of heard it a couple different word phrasings of it. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I need to, remind myself that I deserve grace, that I'm worthy of grace, and that's not really how grace works.
Right. Well, you said a key word, right?
Yeah, one of them.
I'm sure you said something important in there, right, Rand? Deserve. Deserve is a word of trade. And see, this is where our heads blow up. Because in order to be worthy, I have to deserve something. So what does grace offer us? What does it offer us? Go back to the definition we talked about at the beginning. To be accepted in spite of our unacceptability. We have gotten drilled so much with what can I give in return as a trade for what I'm getting that we've forgotten how to live as loved. And that's where we go off the rails, I think, is a preview of my workshop tomorrow afternoon. That's why we don't know how to live out of our hearts, because we want to cut a trade, and that's been around forever. I mean, the men's group I'm in, we've been studying and looking at the Jacob's encounter with God at the Jabbok, and something that caught my attention was how, I think we all know, right? Jacob had the struggle with God, the encounter with God, and he walks away with a new name, okay? His old name, Jacob, means what? Deceiver or snatcher or grabber, okay? And he has this encounter with God and all-night wrestling match with maybe the pre-incarnate Christ, probably, which says something of his endurance for a guy his age. Going all night wrestling is admirable. But then it gets down to the blessing, and he says, "What is your name?" And the angel says, "What business is that of yours?" And then says and pronounces a blessing on him and says, "From here on out you will be called Israel, because you strove with God." The funny thing about that is everything that we've seen about Jacob up until that point in time, he has always cut a deal. Always cut a deal. So when he thought that Lamech was lusting after his wife, he cut a deal. He said, "Make sure you call yourself my sister, and then we'll get out of this thing alive. I'll get out of this thing alive." In his interaction with God, he doesn't cut a deal. And then he lets himself be known. And wrestling does that. Okay? The one thing I have said so many times before is there is no time when I am closer to God than when I'm wrestling with him. Not when I'm doing everything right. When I'm wrestling with him. And Jacob is a prime example of that. And he walks out and actually is given a name to say, "Keep striving." And he will. He's a knucklehead. He's just part of us. But I think that's part of what we have a hard time kind of grasping, is how do I embrace being fully loved as I am, not as I should be. Period. No conditions. Remember back? Jean Valjean, remember? No bargains, no petitions, just you. That's it. And suddenly it gets really uncomfortable. Why? Because we want to dilute the power of love like that. We want to dilute it with a trade. That kind of love scares the crap out of us because it can't be controlled. A trade can. I can break the conditions and then it falls apart and we're back to me being a miserable worm. But when you look at it, and I'll just say this and I'll move on. When you look at John's relationship with Jesus, it is truly ironic that he actually labels himself, this is John writing it, labels himself the disciple that Jesus loved. And we would say, well, that's kind of arrogant to call yourself that and compare, see where we're going, compared to all the other disciples. And it's like somebody embraced their belovedness by being able to say that openly. And I think that's what I think that's what we're called to. Yeah.
So kind of like a follow-up. Do you think that, I guess, like the Christian community needs to change the way they're conveying like they're unworthy of grace? And do you think that Christians are more prone to being in a shame-based culture because of what we're told?
Well, the second one, absolutely, irrevocably, yes. We are a shame-based culture. I'm justly accused. Now, we're generations into this culture. So, I think for a lot of us, we don't become aware of how marinating in shame we are, because it's just like fish in water. The second part of it, or the first part of your question, Mia, in terms of being unworthy of grace, yes, that is a fact. Nobody's going to debate that theologically. But how does it get translated into a reality in our lives? And it's that connection that's hard, because the fact has to lead to something else. And that fact doesn't lead us to the humility, the need, the dependency, we translate it into, therefore I've got to work real hard and do all the right things and create a better me, so that what? Are we going to become any more worthy? No, but we are made worthy by grace. And so when that happens, then what do? I live fully into that. And I think that's what's missing. Is that I know this because I've been a teaching pastor. I've talked to a lot of pastors, and there's a lot of their sermons that they are frightened of giving people license to live free, because they think that they're giving them license to do anything they want. I mean, the dirty secret is they will anyway. So there's a verse that I'm just now reading through, and it said, you were set free, for freedom you were set free by Christ. And that we don't take that very seriously, because with freedom, I make mistakes, I do it wrong, I confess my sin, I do it differently, but I don't have to add all the unworthiness, self-deprecation, self-loathing. I don't have to add all that stuff. And that's where the shame culture comes in, I think. So, like I said before, I think the worst part about shame is it works. I don't think we'd keep using it if it didn't work. That's just the bottom line as humans. We don't like grace because it takes too long. Like a life long. It sucks. So, yeah, Ron.
Oh, I think I did a separate rant about this in a different class. I really don't like the idea of like, well, the church needs to change this. It's like, because isn't that us?
Right.
And like, obviously there's people with a higher standing. The other big place that I hear it is like, well, CCU has such a judgmental culture.
Right.
I'm like,
Right.
Okay. And so that we.
Right.
No, that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Like.
It leads nowhere,
Yeah.
other than self-condemnation. We always know where that leads.
Or redirecting
The attention.
the blame or something.
Right.
And I think when we work on completely transforming ourselves,
Right.
and not and obviously being honest, like speaking truth to power, is
Right.
important in that.
Right.
But just kind of a blanket, like the big bad Christian culture
Right.
statements, they just kind of irk me to that extent.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we've raised the bitching session to a professional level around here about the community, and so like you're saying, to what point? So, essentially, the challenge then still comes back to, so what am I doing with me? And that's, quite honestly, Reinhold Niebuhr once made the mention of the fact that, and I think I put this quote up on a slide, was that revolution in the church doesn't come from radical new ideas. It's from a rediscovery of the radically old ideas, of living fully in my sphere, within me, and bringing that before God, and then worrying about let the other stuff kind of deal with itself. Quite honestly, I think that's usually where a lot of revolutions start, is in individuals. A lot of and some of you guys may know this better than me, but a lot of the great awakenings of mankind in human civilization has been two people reconciling. And then it just kind of blew out from there, and these huge awakenings occur, religious awakenings. So anyway, I don't know how we got on that, but it's always interesting. Shame is about our person. I've already mentioned it's about exposure. Ultimately, when our masks are pulled off, the judged and condemned parts of ourselves get exposed, and that's so foreign to us that the reality is that we kind of cringe when it happens. So if we decide to take our masks off, we cringe waiting for the blow to fall, and it doesn't, and then we do it anyway within us, because we're so self-regulating when it comes to some of this stuff. So it's about being ostracized, feeling like the outsider, and it's about self-loathing and understanding why people hate you too. And see, that's just the thing about self-loathing, is that it is a self-perpetuating belief system within us. Because when we do something wrong, it's only proof that we really are worthy of the hate that we feel like people have toward us. When we don't do something wrong and people don't respond, we're just waiting for the next time that will occur. Brene Brown has a word for that, right? Impending joy. Is that things that are starting to look good and we just expect something bad to happen. And that's a narrative you hear a lot of people. It's like the other shoe's going to drop somehow. So we have, if there's any kind of errors in judgment, human judgment that we can relate to the most strongly, it really is the confirmation bias. Because once we have established a belief system, we tend to look for evidence to confirm it over and over and over again. And that includes this particularly. And that's exactly why it's so hard to identify, I think. Because we have done a masterful job at self-indoctrination. And that's that pulls us up short fairly quickly. So we looked at embarrassment, we looked at guilt and shame. The last one is more of a public thing, and that's humiliation. And it takes all of these, guilt, shame, embarrassment, everything, all of these ruthless words and conclusions into the public domain and directed toward us or someone else. And it's interesting, Donald Klein made this comment. He said, people believe they deserve their shame, but they don't believe they deserve their humiliation, because it's a step beyond. It's like, not only have you done something shameful, now I'm going to punish you for it. And so that's usually where where the humiliation ends up coming in. Now, recognize for a minute that all of these terms that we're using are very, very self-defined. So you hear somebody say they're talking in a class, or they were talking with a friend, and they make the comment, "Oh, I felt so humiliated." And usually it's not that the other person said anything to them directly. It's more of what they're saying internally about what happened in that public sphere. And so the reason that this is so dangerous to us, and the reason why we feel it so intensely, is because it happened in public. And then now other people can see it, and other people can point it out or remember it or use it against us, or whatever the phrasing is that you want to take it. But in a lot of cases, I think most people don't think that they deserve humiliation. They believe they deserve their shame, but they don't deserve to be publicly humiliated. And the challenge is how sensitive I think some people have become, because because somebody can say something, whether it's in a group or whatever else, and the group leader kind of pointed out, and they feel humiliated, even though the group leader is simply pointing out the nature of what they just said. So now we're in this problem area where if everything is turned into humiliation, now we're just fueling the fires of our self-loathing through the humiliation we feel that's shown in the public domain. And that makes it that much harder. Obviously, we create a variety of sensitivities, if you will, that are part of that. So the key with shame or any of these other ones is not only the fact that they exist, but also how does it feel to us, what's part of our experiences. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit here, because how do we experience it? Is this layering of conflicting social and community expectations. And usually we know that we have violated them because we have been so socialized into them. And so the thing that I think I may have mentioned in here, I never am sure because these classes are overlapping, but I think in a lot of cases, your efforts in your groups to engage and be known and those sorts of things, it may not seem like much, but it violates the expectations that once the group is over and you walk back out into the larger community, those things are violating expectations, those behaviors, those risks even. But yet I think the risks end up perpetuating or at least facilitating the kind of growth that most of us would say we want. The problem is most of the growth we want is we don't want uncomfortable growth. We want growth, but we don't want to, pay anything for it. So essentially, it's about who we should be. It's not just our person, but it's who we should be. And there is an extra layer here in terms of the Christian community and Christian language even, like being Christ-like. And unfortunately, we haven't dove in deep enough to even define what that means. Because we know Jesus is divine, but what about his humanity? I mean, did he feel the rub of disappointment or a feeling unapproved of or things like that? And I think we have a hard time walking into that. And yet, interestingly enough, when Jesus drew his disciples together outside in the Decapolis, which is where 10 cities were, and he pulled them together and he asked a very, very telling question if you look at it from a human point of view, okay, not a divine point of view, but a human. He says to his disciples, and I actually believe this question is like me asking a question and you guys not knowing whether you want to answer it or not. And it's like deer in the headlights look. Because he says, who do people say I am? And that's an oh crap moment for the disciples. Because they've been talking the entire time. They have been talking and comparing notes and everything else. And now Jesus looks them directly dead in the face and says, who do people say I am? Do we tell him? And what would motivate Jesus to ask his disciples that? I mean, quite honestly, from his humanity, I think it got pretty tiring always fighting this battle with people that didn't believe him. And so, even as humanity, he says, who are people saying I am? It's an interesting question, right? Because he can answer that. He knows the minds of men. Why ask his disciples? And I think to some degree, it betrays the human concern of Jesus about how he's being perceived. Now, he could go the easy route. I get that. But essentially, why do we ask questions at all? And we ask questions in some respects to allow a person to actually own their thoughts enough to tell me. I don't do anybody any favor when I already have a pretty good idea of what they're thinking, and then I ask a question along that line of thinking. I don't do them any favors at all. Can I do that? Yeah, probably. I've listened to enough stories over the years to have a pretty good guess. But I ask not because I can guess. I ask because I'm asking them to own what they believe, what they're actually saying. And so this idea of being like Christ is an exceedingly high standard. And so that gets added into this, and then it's, okay, well, I'll never measure up to that, and so I give up. What's the point? I can't get there. Or the idea of being above reproach. We can make every effort to do that, but above reproach ends up being calibrated off of other people's perceptions. And I can't control those. So I can make efforts to do it otherwise, or representing Jesus is another one that I hear a lot of. So there's these layerings of social kind of expectations that we kind of feel kind of weighing us down when we move into these places. And the other thing that's interesting about this is these social expectations are very different for men and women. I mean, I could engage a conversation with you all, and it would take us all the rest of this hour talking about expectations for men and women, whether it's on this campus or anywhere else. And that's true when it comes to this idea of shame. So we have that different for men and women, and ultimately it really is dictating to us what we should be, which is what is, as I said early on when I started talking about this, what is a good little boy or a good little girl? What is a real man, the context of that? What exactly is that? And we can say what we want it to be or what we think it should be, but what is it out there that we are still find ourselves trying to conform to or live by? And those sorts of things are what layer in on top of us about our how we live our lives, how we manage our behavior, how we manage change even. Because in a lot of cases, people will talk about and be vulnerable with things that have already happened, rather than being vulnerable about the things that are actually now going on. And most of the time when we talk about an issue that we have, we also offer the issue, but we also offer the solution that we're already engaged in. And that's another way that we do these things. So I'm struggling with ... but I've already got an accountability group in, I've got a whatever the strategies are. So essentially we cut our detractors off at the pass because they can't critique us because we're not doing anything about it. And how often, if you go to an AA meeting or other places where the emphasis is on honesty, that somebody says, I'm struggling with and I don't really care, I'm going to stay here. Because that's the truth. And more often than not, even in those contexts, they'll say, well, thanks for at least being honest. Because we can't change what we won't accept. Okay? So, the other thing that we have to contend with is fear, which is driving a lot of this behavior. We are biologically, emotionally, spiritually, cognitively wired for connection. So we notice the minute that this connection gap gets bigger, we're already scrambling to try to bring it back to a manageable level. That's where we're managing our how we portray ourselves, how we talk, the words we use. And the way that this gets at it is shown up in ridicule, in feeling diminished, and feeling fundamentally flawed. While we would say, I know I am, but that's not okay. And the problem is even when I say, it's not okay that I'm flawed, then suddenly we jump way out on the other end and say, now I'm going to use this as a badge of honor. So with this pendulum swing keeps happening to us over and over and over again. We try to pull it back from the edge by saying, I reject that notion altogether, or I just, I've given up, or whatever that be. But being exposed jeopardizes our connection and the sense of being worthy of acceptance. And we are highly, highly, highly calibrated off of that. We've been highly calibrated off of it since we started bonding with our mother and father. We've been calibrated off of that ever since then. And children are socialized even into that, right? I mean, they just cry and the caregiver responds. And that's the connection. And we get more and more sophisticated. And we learn different ways to ask for the connection to be reestablished, or whatever that might be. But at some point in time, we connect our acceptability to the connection that we gain. And so now I have to be acceptable in order to be connected, rather than unacceptable in some way. So what we have before us, with all these social expectations and everything, with the fear that's kind of the major engine behind all of these things, what we have is something that, and I mentioned it to Mia as we were talking, the idea of the double bind. But the specific definition is a situation in which options are very limited, and all of them expose us to penalty, censure, or deprivation. Now, like I said, the common parlance is damned if you do and damned if you don't. And so when we experience shame and fear, blame usually isn't very far behind. Our tendency, going to the same thing about talking about Christian community, is we point the gun another direction. And that's where the blame comes up, and we use blame to deal with our feelings of powerlessness. So when we experience shame, it's really hard to maintain a sense of agency, like I can do something here. Shame has a way of burying us to such a degree that we are very, very tempted to just give up. Say, what's the point? It doesn't matter what I do, it's not going to get any better. The hardest part of that, in some respects, is when we meet somebody who isn't willing to live by the narrative we've created around this. In other words, they're not going to leave. They're not going to see us differently just because we think we're unworthy. And they're tenacious and unwavering in their belief in us. And as much as we love it and appreciate it and all of that, there's always this lurking fear, here comes some impending joy, the lurking fear that it will be taken away. And so when you're working with adolescents, we have this phrase and you see it being developed in adolescence, it's called active mastery. And the way the active mastery works is that I will hurt me before you hurt me, because after all, you will hurt me. And so pain on my terms is always better than pain coming from somebody else. And we do that same thing with shame. We do the same thing. When we have something that's better than we could ever imagine, or it can't be this good, we run the risk, again, just like I said earlier, we run the risk of self-sabotage. Because we don't think we deserve it, and sooner or later it's going to run away or go away or leave us, so I'm going to make it happen now on my terms, because at least it's my terms. Yeah, Cody?
Do you think when we extend this to people that often they'll meet us there? Because, I don't know, I could see it going two ways, and I just like your experience on it. when you extend this unwaveringness to people, I think it can go, like you're saying, where they're like, well, this is too good to be true.
Right.
They backstab themselves before it happens.
Right.
But I don't even know, how would somebody accept that?
Yeah.
Look like?
Yeah. Well, and I guess I've seen it in the counseling realm, where in a lot of cases the counselor is reflecting that. And I think I've mentioned, I think I mentioned to you guys the lady that used to be the missionary from Mongolia. Have I mentioned her to you? And she was that kind of person. I mean, she had 2 different attempts on her life while she was in Mongolia, and grew up in a really very, very abusive family. And she honestly did not think that she was worthy of anyone's attention, really. And she would sabotage time and time again when I started meeting with her. And some of it was blaming me because I didn't show up at the time that she expected me to show up. Like I'd be late. And she would really get sideways. And what I began to realize was it was an effort to push me away. And so I didn't back away. We've been talking for almost a decade now. And she's a different person. But it's been by very small increments that she has absorbed my unwavering commitment to her as a person of value that is worthy of my time and my attention, and withstanding some pretty stout kind of attacks, actually. And I've seen that over and over again, is that some people, a little bit like Joubert, can't handle it and they leave. There are others like her that hang with me because there's something that says there's something trustworthy about this person. I'm going to give it a shot. And everything about her life is really not even recognizable from where she started. So it is more likely the first one you described. It's more likely because we value control and safety over risk and being known. So we're going to go that route. And sometimes we do that in various iterations, and then finally maybe we bump up against somebody who's every bit as stubborn as we are, and they just don't give up. And it's just enough to be redemptive. So, okay. So the other thing to keep in mind is just power. And Brene talks about this, the difference between power over and personal power. In some context, she mentions talking about the theorist Karen Horney, who talks about power against, power away, and power over. And the power over is just the most insidious form of this, is I will define who you are, and then I will make you believe that it's your own definition. And the only way, and really, I mean, in some respects, this is exactly the voice of shame. I will define you for who you are and get you to believe that it's your own definition. That's the voice of shame. So the way to overcome that is to reclaim or to claim our own personal power, our own personal agency. So you've read already where Brene talks about the shame stuff that we're interacting with, the gremlins and so forth. She says you've got to drag them into relationship. That is personal power. Because when we drag them into the light, we can see them for what they are, and then we can do the things that we're empowered to do, and that is do some change, make some change. So what's key here is that this sometimes will not necessarily show up ostensibly in the relationship itself, but by how I'm treated, by very subtle cues about my needs and how I express them, or how I ask other people to meet them, and their response to that, I make conclusions. And those conclusions then serve that definition that we're talking about here. So the personal power is defined as this ability to act or produce an effect. It's called personal agency. And the other word sometimes we use is instrumentality. But personal power is unlimited. It is not a zero sum. If you have it, if I have it, you don't. And if you have it, I don't. That's what I mean by zero sum. So if the person has both people have personal power, there's actually a greater chance of connectedness, really, because we're owning the things that are rightfully ours, and then having the instrumentality to invite other people into it. But it can be created in the context of relationship with others, not necessarily taking it away from others. See, our tendency is to think in zero-sum terms. So if I assert my personal power, and really good example is boundaries, is that how can two people have good boundaries without it colliding? But see, if they both have the personal power necessary to do that, actually intimacy is possible. But it's not possible with poor boundaries. Intimacy is between two people. If we're fused or we have no boundaries between us, there cannot be intimacy. There can be a high degree of similarity, but it's not necessarily intimacy. So it includes this consciousness, awareness and choice and change. It's all three of those things. And so when you hear the word empowerment, okay, in a variety of contexts, it actually is encouraging people to accept their own personal power. That's what empowerment means. And so how do I accentuate somebody's personal power? And that's the challenge in counseling. That's the challenge in good friendships and things like that, is that I want somebody to have all the personal power that's rightfully theirs, which means, let's put it in practical terms, no is an acceptable answer. Because if I take no for an answer from somebody, I am validating their personal power. But when I don't take no for an answer, I'm stealing it. And that's the backdrop to what we're talking about here. So that's why she says it can be created in the context of a relationship, but we've got to understand that one doesn't negate the other. They can certainly complement one another in a lot of ways. When one person doesn't feel quite so powerful, the other person helps them and empowers them to do that. So how we experience this thing with consciousness, choice, and change, when shame hits, we are not conscious of what we're feeling or why. Most of the time we do not have an identity. And remember what I said before, we lack the vocabulary for it. But usually what we do notice is these overwhelming feelings of confusion, of fear, of judgment, or a need to escape or hide. And those are clues, okay? Those are clues that are pointing us to this is when it hits. It's when I feel like I want to crawl in a hole, or I want to run out of the room. Or even I get angry. And for a lot of Christians, unfortunately, anger is a threatening emotion, because we have been, again, taught oftentimes to not be angry. So it throws us into this crisis mode. And when that starts to happen, as she points out, it's so threatening that rather than processing it where we can think and evaluate, it's thrown into the fight, flight, or freeze response, or shut down. That's the new addition these days. So the backdrop to this thing is such that it makes it difficult then to process what's going on. And when we see somebody else in it or we see ourselves in it, we have to be very careful to not pile on more shame. I should be able to do this. This shouldn't knock me on my butt. This shouldn't be that big of a deal. See, we pull out all the shoulds then. which is part of the survival mode. And we're not processing things in a truth-oriented way or thinking, analyzing, reacting sort of way. We're now into the fight, flight, or freeze, or just shut down. And the kind of a paralysis mode. And a lot of times you can see this happening, or you can even feel it happening within yourself, is that you're turtling. Pull everything in, let your shell handle everything else. And that's one of the keys. I mean, if people say, so how do I know? It's usually these things that tend to tell us when this is happening. Okay, I'm going to stop for a sec here. Any questions, clarifications needed, anything like that? Yeah, Cody.
Are we going to go over how to get out of that?
Eventually. You got a group on Wednesday. You can always pose it to your therapist or your counselor. Don't tell Corey I put you up for that, but she'll hate me. But any other questions or anything? All right. Well, what I want to do is introduce something else, and this is taking a route away from Brene Brown, and I feel compelled to put this up, partly because of the material that's going to be forthcoming, and it looks a little bit like this. It's caveat emptor, if you've ever heard that phrase. It's Latin. Buyer beware. What I want to look at is kind of, it's similar to what we've done with the boundaries and safe people, right? We had kind of profiles of sorts. And I reminded you twice over for both of those that no one person is ever one of these things, right? I mean, that no one person is ever just a manipulative controller or compliant, or in the same way with the safe people, the critic, the irresponsible, or compliant. And so that's going to be true here. But what I want to look at is some various ways in which people handle or how we interact with people around us with shame. And the way that this works is the leading candidates for shame, essentially, and who were around, maybe it's us, that have a tendency to then impact others with shame. And we have to identify the fact of where the voice of shame comes from. It may not be an intentional thing at all. Like we've been talking about, we're many, many generations into this. So this conversation from a shame basis is so automatic and so practiced that we don't even notice when it happens, okay? But some of the leading candidates for shame, the first one is called the guilt spreaders. And these folks tend to espouse this shame equation. One wrong act equals one bad person. I did, therefore I am. And so one lie and you're a liar. And guilt spreaders, in the context of these, is a way that we impact ourselves when it comes to shame. So people that do this are the candidates for shame. That's what I mean by that when I put that up there. So if I'm going to experience shame, I may do it in a variety of ways. These are a variety of voices that tend to do this within me. And so I make one mistake and I am already condemned. And that's what guilt spreaders are like. And the one wrong act and one bad person. So we translate it. The second one is this, and that's the overly responsible. Feel as if they, not God, have the whole world in their hands, as the song goes. insert your own name. And everything that goes badly in lives of the people around them is a reflection on their worth and their responsibility. So they tend to get trapped into the if-onlys. If only I had known, if only I had done, if only I had known better, whatever that might be. So the overly responsible. In a lot of cases, the overly responsible oftentimes are talking about being too much. So a matter of chronic too muchness, if you want to put it that way. They have a hard time, and while you're writing, I'm moving ahead, but the slide will come up. But they have actually a hard time believing God has the whole world in his hands, that they are more than willing to nominate themselves as a consultant for God. And we don't really identify it that way, but sometimes you might be reminded again and again, maybe not, that just remember that you're not the Holy Spirit in somebody else's life. It's the Holy Spirit. So, chronic too muchness, can't believe that only God has the whole world in his hands, and they don't trust him to act as they think he should. So therefore they create their own sense of urgency and responsibility. There is so much conversation I've had over the years where people feel like their needs, how they express it, their emotions are too much for anybody. And so they crank it all back and cover it over with a kind of a concrete top of shame. And if I wasn't, then they wouldn't feel the way they do about me or anything else. So, there are people that spread the guilt. There are people that are overly responsible. You know, the other part of this that comes up with too muchness is this issue of being a burden. And so that comes up as well. And so we do everything we can to make sure we're not in that position or put other people in that position either. Now, this is the tip of the iceberg, but I want to introduce the idea so that you're starting to think about it a little bit. I'm not going to go any further today. It's probably far enough as it is. And then we'll finish them up. There's a dozen of them. So like I said, no one person is ever one of these. And so we'll probably find bits and pieces of ourselves in all of them. So, okay, any questions or anything? No, you're feeling like Thanksgiving turkey. Stick me, I'm done. So, okay, see you next week. And those of you in my group, see you Wednesday.